laws. The consequences of legalization of cannabis in the state of New Jersey based on the existing scientific evidence. So before I start, I would like to record this session for those who cannot make it tonight. So just letting everyone know that this meeting is being recorded in the state of New Jersey. So we have colleagues from different backgrounds in the at the Cannabis Research Institute, from disciplines such as public health, nursing, political science, and criminal justice and sociology, and communication disorder. And we'll be talking about all of these topics today. So just giving you a little background about the Institute. The Institute was formed in January 2019 under the initiative by the President Dobler. So the mission of the Institute is to provide data-driven and evidence-based information, scientific information, to policymakers at the state, local, and municipal level, and also to the community that we are basically active in the across the state of New Jersey. So if I can just move these slides forward, advance them. So let me see. Okay, so as I said, we have colleagues and experts from different disciplines. So the way we're going to be presenting is that Dr. Shalom would start by talking about legal and political backgrounds. Then Dr. Wilson talks about criminal justice implications of the cannabis legalization. Then Dr. Kekojevic talks about the public health implications. And then Dr. Collier, Marshall, and Dr. Dean would be talking about cognitive, communication, learning, and mental health implications. And I will wrap up by talking about economic and policy implications of cannabis legalization across the US and lessons that we can learn from them for the state of New Jersey, for the case of New Jersey. So Steve, please go ahead.
Okay, so you have to unshare your screen, Rahi?
Sure, I'll do that.
Actually, before we do that, we have two poll questions because we want to hear from the audience. So we're going to activate those polls. The first question is, are you talking about marijuana legalization in your social circles, in your educational circles, in your business circles? And the second one is, should marijuana be legalized in the state of New Jersey? So you should be able to see that popping up. I can see that we're getting some responses here, and it's going to be open probably for, I think, a minute. I think, Rahi, we'll see when it closes.
Sure.
Okay, so it looks like a lot of people have had a chance to answer. We have a few answers trickling in, but by majority, it looks like people are talking about marijuana legalization in their circles. Some haven't. Maybe at the end of the presentation, we can figure out those who aren't talking about it. Is there a discomfort or unfamiliarity issue? And then we also see that by majority, people do feel that marijuana should be legalized in the state of New Jersey. So we at the Cannabis Research Institute feel like this is a very timely presentation, so we can figure out how to go about addressing some of the issues that you might have. So I'm going to turn it back over to our chair, Rahi.
Thank you, Lashana. I think it's Steve's turn to just talk about the political and legalization of cannabis. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Steve, you can go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to talk about the legal and political background of cannabis in the United States and in New Jersey. So marijuana essentially became illegal in the United States back in 1937. In the 1950s, substantial federal penalties were enacted for marijuana possession. And then in the 1970s, with the war on drugs, the penalties became draconian. In neighboring New York State, under the Rockefeller drug laws, possession of more than 4 ounces of marijuana carried a minimum sentence of 15 years in prison. But then in 1996, California legalized marijuana for medical use. And in subsequent years, additional states followed suit. New Jersey legalized medical marijuana in 2010. Today, there are 33 states plus the District of Columbia where medical marijuana is legal. In 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington legalized recreational marijuana. Today, there are 11 states plus the District of Columbia where marijuana is legal for recreational use. So this map shows the medical marijuana states. Those are the ones in the light green, and the recreational marijuana states, which also have legal medical marijuana, in the dark green. In addition, some states have decriminalized marijuana. This is not the same as legalization. Decriminalization means personal use of marijuana will not result in a jail sentence or a criminal record, but users still get their marijuana from illegal drug dealers. With legalization, on the other hand, the state regulates and authorizes the commercial sale of marijuana and can tax the proceeds. So this map shows the legalization states, those are the ones in dark red, the decriminalized states in the sort of darker pink, and the sort of light orangish or partial decriminalization states. So you'll see that it's not just the coastal states, but quite a number of states in the interior of the country as well. In addition, some states have enacted expungement policies, which means that previous marijuana convictions are eliminated, so you no longer have a criminal record. As you can see here, New Jersey is one of the states that has enacted automatic expungement. Next month, in November, there are 4 states that have marijuana legalization on the ballot for the voters to decide on. One of them is New Jersey, as can be seen here, along with Montana, South Dakota, and Arizona. On your New Jersey ballot, candidates are listed on side 1, but if you flip it over to side 2, you'll see 3 ballot questions. If you vote at a voting machine, the ballot questions are on the right side of your screen. Ballot question 1 is the marijuana legalization question. And you vote, you fill in these dots down at the bottom, yes or no. And here's the official explanation of the ballot question. Do you approve of amending the Constitution, that's the Constitution of the state of New Jersey, to legalize a controlled form of marijuana called cannabis? Only adults at least 21 years of age could use cannabis. The state commission, created to oversee the state's medical cannabis program, would also oversee the new personal use cannabis market. Cannabis products would be subject to the state sales tax. If authorized by the legislature, a municipality may pass a local ordinance to charge a local tax on cannabis products. Now, if the amendment passes, it goes into effect on January 1st, 2021, But the state legislature and the Cannabis Regulatory Commission would still need to work out many of the details. And that's the reason that many experts predict that it could take a year or more before the first legal recreational marijuana could actually be sold in New Jersey. But it's important to know that despite any state laws, marijuana remains illegal under federal law. And that has a number of consequences. Credit card companies will not support cannabis businesses for fear they're going to run afoul of federal law. Cannabis businesses can't operate across state lines. Cannabis businesses can't deduct typical business expenses on their taxes. In fact, the federal government could prosecute anyone at any time for violating federal marijuana laws, even for medical marijuana, despite what your state law says. Now, the Obama administration in 2013 issued a memorandum saying, okay, even though it's illegal under federal law, if you're following state law, we're not going to waste federal law enforcement dollars enforcing those federal laws. The Trump administration in 2018 rescinded that memo, and therefore federal prosecutors do have the right to enforce federal marijuana laws, though thus far it has not been done. So so ultimately, we need to change laws at the federal level if we want to remove all the penalties for marijuana, even the penalties for marijuana in a state like New Jersey that may decide to legalize. So here's an example of a federal bill. This is a bill, this is not a law. It's called the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, the MORE, M-O-R-E, the MORE Act. It was proposed in 2019 and has been renewed in 2020 as a proposal. And this bill decriminalizes marijuana. And among the things it does is it sets up a trust fund and this trust fund would be used to compensate communities that have been impacted by the war on drugs. And some of those impacts will be talked about by Dr. Wilson in a few moments. It imposes a 5% federal tax on cannabis products, and those funds get deposited into the trust fund. No longer can federal benefits be denied to people who've had cannabis convictions. So technically, you can't get student financial aid if you've been convicted of a cannabis offense. It prevents the denial of benefits under immigration laws on the basis of cannabis-related convictions. And it establishes a process to expunge convictions from your record. This bill in the Senate was sponsored by Senator Kamala Harris, who may become vice president. The co-sponsors include Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. In the House, there are 115 sponsors, almost all of them Democrats. This is out of 435 representatives, so it's about a quarter of them, including 10 representatives from New Jersey. But as I said, this is not yet law. Indeed, the New Jersey legalization isn't yet law. That will depend on what happens on November 3rd. Okay, I'm now going to stop sharing and turn things over to Dr. Wilson.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Sean Wilson. I'm an assistant professor in the sociology and criminal justice department. And today I'm going to discuss some of the criminal justice implications of marijuana legalization it's extremely important for us to look at how legalizing marijuana can impact the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, and how people experience justice in New Jersey. So Dr. Shalom did a great job of kind of highlighting how drug policies have changed throughout the years. If we look at the war on drugs and how it focused on utilizing the criminal justice system to respond to public health issues, right? And so substance abuse, instead of focusing on that issue as a public health issue, it became a crime issue. And a lot of states became focused with punishing people for substance abuse issues. And so if you look at the list of various laws that are on this screen, you can kind of see how policies have changed throughout the years. From 1933, from the New Jersey Uniform Narcotic Drug Act, to more contemporary times, if we fast forward to 2009, where we passed the Compassionate Use Medical Marijuana Act, which established legal medical marijuana here in New Jersey. And if we fast forward from 2009 to where we are now, there have been a lot of discussions and bills to try to legalize marijuana in New Jersey. Unfortunately, our legislators weren't able to pass a bill that can legalize marijuana. So it's left to us citizens to decide what we want to do when it comes to legalizing marijuana. And so we're at public question number 1, which a lot of you have chimed in, kind of shared your perspectives and beliefs about marijuana. And the results from that poll are actually similar to public polling. For the most part, the majority of citizens believe that we need to legalize marijuana. So it's important for us when we examine the implications of legalizing marijuana. So it's also important for us to deeply and critically analyze New Jersey and how New Jersey has enforced marijuana laws in recent years. From 2000 to 2013, New Jersey made nearly 280,000 marijuana possession arrests. And if we average that per year, that's around 24,000 arrests. And the overwhelming majority of these arrests are people who are using drugs. So many of these punitive drug policies were passed and enforced to try to respond to people who traffic drugs. But we see in practice, the policies actually target and impact people who use marijuana in the state. And if we compare New Jersey to other states in the nation, we rank in the top 3 when it comes to marijuana arrest rates. So why is that important for us to look at arrest rates in New Jersey? Well, we see that overwhelmingly Black and brown communities are disproportionately impacted by marijuana laws. For example, Blacks are 3 times more likely than whites to be arrested for possession, although both groups use marijuana at similar rates. And if we look at disparities across the state, we find that all but 7 counties in New Jersey had a racial disparity above the national average. And if we look at that data, what's most alarming is that when you look at demographics of municipalities, we oftentimes find that municipalities that aren't as diverse have higher disparity rates. So this is, a statewide issue that we need to examine. And so someone, person of color navigating throughout New Jersey, they kind of have to be mindful of where they're going, because depending on where they're going, they could be stopped. They can come in contact with the criminal justice system, especially if someone is in possession of marijuana. And so these are things to think about, and the harms that these policies have caused to communities of color. And we'll get to that in a later slide, but it's important for us to think about these harms, right? Because public policy is supposed to protect us. But we found here in New Jersey, when it comes to marijuana laws, That's not the reality. So there's several collateral consequences of marijuana arrest. One, you could lose your job, depending on where you work, but also it could be extremely hard to find employment with a criminal record. Not to mention potentially going to jail, losing your freedom, having to pay fines and fees. And if you're a person from a marginalized community, you may not have the money to pay fees and fines for marijuana possession. But if you don't pay those fees, you could potentially, right, be incarcerated for not paying your fees. Also, the loss of immigration status. For those who are living in public housing, you can lose your public housing. And that's been a reality for many communities of color, having family members who were arrested for marijuana possession. And as a result, the whole family can lose their housing. The loss of substantial financial aid for college is extremely important. That can be something that can be cut. If you think about our federal laws, they prevent people with marijuana possession from oftentimes being able to acquire financial aid for education. And not to mention how a marijuana arrest can follow somebody for their whole lives. And so a lot of advocates and activists and people who do a lot of work, such as ACLU, the New Jersey Drug Policy Alliance, they do a lot of work around trying to inform policymakers about sensible drug policy. And so some of their recommendations are for us to consider the harms that have occurred from the war on drugs and to find solutions that empower and fix some of the historical harms that have stemmed from punitive criminal justice policies. And I mean, these policies have destroyed whole communities. They've prevented people from being able to progress and succeed in society. And it's extremely important that we really consider these harms, especially during the era of Black Lives Matter, right? We oftentimes talk about how police brutality is an important issue that needs to be critically analyzed or addressed in society, but oftentimes we don't necessarily also speak about some of the flawed criminal justice policies that oftentimes harm and destroy communities of color. So those are things that a lot of legislators are beginning to address now. And so it's going to be interesting to see if marijuana is indeed legalized, what that bill will look like. Will the bill, speak to the harms that have historically happened in New Jersey when it comes to drug policy? Or will communities that are mostly impacted by these policies continue to be ignored? And so this is definitely an important conversation for all of us to have, right? So what are some of the potential criminal justice related benefits from cannabis legalization? Well, one, we first want to decrease some of the disparities in the criminal justice system. So if marijuana becomes legalized, less Black and brown people will be arrested for marijuana offenses. We'll be able to hopefully redirect some of the resources that the criminal justice system spent on incarcerating communities in rebuilding and repairing these communities. And the criminal legal system here in New Jersey should have more resources if they're able to redirect funds that they invested into the war on drugs into rebuilding communities. And also, we can find ways to invest in evidence-based public safety programs that successfully respond to crime. And we found that many of the drug policies in New Jersey haven't addressed crime issues. And so we can think smarter about crime and social issues if we were to potentially be able to reinvest and reimagine what justice looks like in New Jersey. Thank you.
Oh, I'm having issues. I can't share the screen.
Do you want me to share the screen and just advance?
Yeah, I can share the screen, please.
Sure.
And while we're doing that, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. So if you have spoken, if you could just click on the Q&A and answer those questions, they're specifically for Dr. Shalom and Dr. Wilson.
Rahi, are you sharing the screen?
Yeah, just a second. Sorry. Okay, I'm almost there.
Thank you. I apologize for this. My name is Alex Gitsoyevich. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Public Health. And in sharing the public health perspective on marijuana legalization, I will utilize this framework, public health framework, that consists of three core functions, which are assessment, which represents a systematic collection of data, analyzing and making that information available; policy development, which is use of scientific knowledge to promote the sound policies and decision making; and as well as assurance, which is represents ensuring provision of services, linking the services to community and training the workforce. So assessment, in terms of assessment, next slide, please. Assessment, the core principle of assessment is that we need the data to inform and shape a policy. So it is likely that we will need the data to monitor the prevalence of use of marijuana, as well as to monitor health effects. And this data is likely to come from a variety of different sources, including National Survey on Drug Abuse, Drug Use and Health, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System, National College Health Assessment, etc. Here's what data tells us before we actually legalize, before we proceed with legalizing marijuana. Next slide, please. This is a data from New Jersey National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which shows that about a little bit less than 1 million of New Jersey inhabitants have used the marijuana in the past year. And out of these 931,000, 88,000 people used the marijuana for the first time. In another piece of the data, this is again data from 2018, from New Jersey Substance Abuse Monitoring System. It registered over 11,000 of admissions in which primary drug of abuse was marijuana. Next slide, please. If we look with the New Jersey youth, 18 to 25 years old, if we compare the two time periods, one from 2002 to 2005 and the other one from 2014 to 2017, we see about 5% increase in youth use of marijuana. However, that is at par with increases that we see both regionally and as well as nationally. Next slide, please. And since we are an academic institution, here's some data showing the use of cannabis among college students. This is the data that comes from Monitoring the Future study. So past year, this is a national data, past year cannabis use among college students remains at high levels. It has increased 9% over the last 5 years. And one additional issue that has risen is that we also seen an increase in cannabis vaping. And however, that increase has been greater among non-college youth. Another study that was recently published, next slide, please. Another study that was recently published in Journal of Addiction shows that between 2012 and 2028, overall use among, that study compared the use of marijuana use among college students in states that legalized versus states that didn't legalize marijuana. And what it shows that overall use among college students increased approximately 3% in non-legalized in states compared to in states that legalized marijuana compared to those that didn't legalize. Students ages 21 to 26 were more likely to report using marijuana, and there was much higher percentage of daily or almost daily users of cannabis. This effect was stronger among female students and among students who were living off campus. And one good news is that in this study, they've seen actually among students aged 21 and older, a greater drop in binge drinking in states where marijuana was legalized compared to states where marijuana was not legal. Next slide, please. Some other health effects that come out of studies that actually have been conducted in the states that have legalized marijuana. In Colorado, for example, they've seen an increase in RV, in emergency room visits, and that was attributable to cannabis, particularly to inhaled cannabis. And in 3 states in the West that they legalized marijuana, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, they haven't actually noticed the changes in motor vehicle crash fatality. These motor vehicle crash fatality rates were not significantly different than among those states without recreational marijuana legalization. Next slide, please. In Washington state, one interesting thing that they've seen since retail cannabis stores opened in 2014, they've seen a 3 times increase in unintentional cannabis exposure calls for children between 0 and 5 years old. Next slide, please. Cannabis has been touted as a solution for the US opioid crisis. We know that we're in the midst of opioid crisis. And there's this study that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2014 that showed that from 1999 to 2010, states with medical cannabis laws experienced slower increase in opioid overdose death. And this decrease was about 23%. Next slide, please. However, the more recent study that used the same methods and was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Science showed that study used a longer period of time, and it showed that these findings from this 2014 study really didn't hold over longer period of time. And furthermore, this association between medical cannabis and opioid overdose reversed its direction. So actually, in these states, we've seen an increase in a opioid overdose. And this data hold also after accounting for recreational cannabis laws. Next slide, please. So what are the lessons for New Jersey from assessment? We will need the data. We will need the data to assess the law. And this data will allow us really to focus our prevention efforts on population at the highest risk for adverse effects stemming from marijuana use. Next slide, please. The second core function of public health is, or core principle, is to develop appropriate policies based on data. So ideally, we want to align our policies, our further policies, allow regulations for non-medical and medical marijuana use. It is based on data from the states that have already legalized. Edibles and youth should be the key focus area for regulatory development. And in developing these policies, we can actually leverage knowledge that we gain from successful tobacco and alcohol policy and regulatory experiences. Next slide, please. So what are some of the evidence-based policies to reduce the public health concerns when it comes to marijuana legalization? So again, using these tobacco-free policies and policies on alcohol, policies such as tobacco-free policies or secondhand smoke policies in public spaces to marijuana. Adequate policies on advertising, for example, prohibition of outdoor advertising. And there will be a need for a statewide campaign to educate all the residents about safer, particularly about safer and responsible marijuana use. And some of the key messages should include the health impacts of marijuana on youth, safe marijuana storage, special risks with edible marijuana, and then as well harms of combining marijuana with alcohol and other substances. Next slide, please. So some other policies should include a strict licensing enforcement, banning the presence of minors in retail stores, limiting hours of operation of retail marijuana stores, educating marijuana retail employees about the health effects of marijuana, in particular on the importance of restricting access to youth. And it's also, a lot of states actually also allowed, even states that legalized marijuana so far, they allow the local governments, local county governments to impose a further sales restrictions. For example, in Oregon, after legalization, half of the counties actually have banned recreational sale of marijuana. Next slide, please. So finally, the third core function of public health is assurance. And so the major goals of marijuana enforcement should be to ensure that marijuana products that are sold in the retail environment are free of contaminants. We need to ensure that there's going to be a proper labeling, ensuring a child-resistant marijuana packaging, inspection and certification of marijuana facilities, ensuring a competent workforce. And we also need to provide the relevant marijuana education for healthcare providers. For example, developing clinical guidelines for screening of pregnant or pediatric patients, or informing emergency departments about potential acute events associated with contaminated cannabis products. Next slide, please. So example of assuring the public in terms of a packaging and labeling, there needs to be probably going to need to develop some rules on packaging, labeling, and product safety requirements. And in doing that, we can follow tobacco product lessons. We need to make sure and ensure that packaging cannot appeal to underage youth. For example, limiting number of serving sizes, or again, making these packages that are child resistant to manipulation. So next slide, please. So finally, in the summary, I want to stress that this cannabis legalization bill represents a fundamental policy change. And no doubt that marijuana laws will impact the health of population. Since majority of these polls point that the bill will pass, I would like to take an optimistic or harm reduction approach. One of the major objectives of cannabis legalization includes improving public health outcomes. And there's no doubt that regulated cannabis should be safer in terms of concentration, content, labeling, etc. However, there are many, many important concerns related to cannabis legalization, and the breadth of these public health issues will need to be addressed using a multidisciplinary collaboration between the different disciplines, different health departments, state and local agencies, as well as other stakeholders. I thank you for your time, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Alex. Next.
Hello, my name is Betty Coley. I'm a professor at the Department of Communication Disorders and Sciences. And since my colleague spoke a lot about college and young people using, cannabis, I want to talk a little bit about what we know of the effects of cannabis use on the cognitive and communication skills in children. This has not been studied very much, and perhaps since 1989, there have been a few studies about the potential effects of cannabis on the communication skills and learning and cognition in young people. Now, young people are interesting because their brains are still developing and there are a lot of issues to be discussed here. So one of the studies that I will bring up has to do with looking at executive functions in young children. So executive functions are those that have to do with planning and problem solving, with nonverbal working memory, with verbal working memory, and emotional self-regulation. So children or youngsters not responding impulsively and uncontrollably to various situations, inhibitory behaviors like deciding that something is okay to say or do or not okay to say or do, self-motivation and self-awareness. So these were studied in youngsters who started using cannabis before age 15 and those who started after age 15. So the study found that students who started using cannabis before age 15 had significantly worse scores. They did more poorly in tests of executive functions, in tasks of sustained attention, where they had to focus and maintain their attention for a little while, and in impulse control. And this was compared to a control group of people who did not use cannabis of the same age or those who started using after age 15. Another study had to do with the quantity of cannabis use. So because adolescents' brains are particularly susceptible to the harmful effects of cannabis, since they're still developing, this question is important to have an answer to. And we really don't have an answer to this yet, but there are some studies that point the way to some matters of concern. So for example, adolescents were studied over an 18-month period. This was a longitudinal study. And they were tested at the beginning of the study and then again a year and a half later. And those who used cannabis in high amounts were found to score lower in tests of IQ and to respond more slowly in cognitive tasks. This slowness in giving a response was something that was significant. And again, this data suggests that repeated exposure to cannabis during adolescence may have negative effects on intelligence and cognitive skills. These are associations between these two variables. One cannot say what the exact reason was, but the fact that this robust association was found is kind of alarming. Another thing to think about is young people who have disabilities. And young people with disabilities, be they intellectual or other physical disabilities or learning disabilities, may face another cohort of problems and adverse consequences to the use of cannabis. Part of it may have to do with their ability to tell right from wrong, or whether some behaviors are acceptable, or whether use is acceptable or prudent at a specific time. So again, this was a study that looked at long-term effects of people around high school. So youth with disabilities who reported marijuana consumptions in their senior year in high school had significantly fewer earned high school credits in their coursework, had a lower overall GPA, and had a higher dropout rate in high school compared to youngsters who did not use marijuana and also had disabilities. And then, of course, lifetime cannabis users were significantly less likely to graduate high school. Youth with disabilities who use cannabis were also significantly more likely than non-users to be arrested or to have a friend who's been arrested within 2 years of graduation from high school. And Dr. Wilson mentioned the ill side effects of being arrested for marijuana possession or consumption. And they were also more likely to be daily cigarette smokers later on. So these are things to consider when it comes to use of cannabis by young people. There are many studies on use of cannabis by older adults for different purposes, but this is beyond the focus of this presentation right now. This is just for younger people. And then a study that was just published in August looked at the effects of cannabis on the embryo. This was a large cohort study in Ontario and looked at a few thousand people. And it found a potential association of the incidence of autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, and learning disorders for youngsters whose mother consumed cannabis during pregnancy. Again, this was an association and should be interpreted with caution, but again, it is somewhat alarming. So the incidence of autism spectrum disorder diagnosis was 4 per 1,000 children who were exposed to cannabis compared to the norm, which seems to be about 2.4 for unexposed children. So again, some interesting information to consider and to be interpreted with caution. Thank you.
Next, please. We can't hear you, Brenda.
All right, so I'm Brenda Marshall. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I'm also a master's addiction counselor. I'm a professor in the Department of Nursing, and I also work at Holy Name Medical Center in Teaneck, New Jersey. And I just wanted to go over one brief study of the Canadian experience, which had over 17,000 people that partook in this experience. And in Canada, they had legalization in October of 2018, and this data was collected from the National Cannabis Survey. And basically, what they found was that although cannabis usage had increased, those who were riding in cars were less likely to be riding in cars with persons who had smoked within 2 hours. Also, non-cannabis users were significantly less likely to be in a car with a person who had smoked marijuana or taken marijuana orally after legalization occurred. And that they didn't see any, and this goes along with the Colorado experience, they really didn't see any significant changes in multi-vehicle accidents after legalization. They did find that one of the questions was, where do you buy your pot? And they found that people were no longer, the majority were changing from illegal sources to legal sources. And the one thing that we looked at was the fact that if the prevalence in a society goes up, the possibility or risk for cannabis use disorder also would go up. And what they found was that prevalence was higher in the 15 to 24-year-old range. So it's interesting to think about cannabis use disorder because so many people don't want to consider substance use disorder as an actual disorder, but it's real. It is a DSM-5 disorder that that Lashana is going, Lashana, I don't remember your last name right now. I think it's Dean, Dr. Dean. Yes, Dr. Dean is going to really go into the symptoms and the DSM-5 on cannabis use disorder. But it is a disorder that requires treatment And so what we're finding out is if you have a higher frequency of cannabis use, and that is called DAD, daily or almost daily use, dependence goes up with the usage. And then when we think about that, if you're using a lot of cannabis, you might start using other, and I know there was a question about it being a gateway drug, rather than thinking of a gateway drug, which makes it quite linear. Drug use is not linear. And that's something that we really have to wrap our heads around. One of the things with drug use, just as we see with alcohol use, is that if you're using something that alters your ability to make good decision making, then other drugs that may come in play will often be taken where without that change in cognitive decision making, those drugs would not have been used. We also see that although men are more likely to be frequent users, for women, there's a much faster trajectory from use to disorder. And we're finding that there is a correlation between high daily, almost daily use and borderline personality disorder. It's important to keep in mind that the fact that there's a relationship does not mean that it's a causal relationship. We don't know if a person who is higher use or more frequent use actually has a disorder to begin with that they are self-medicating. And then through the use of cannabis, which is a hallucinogenic, that actually releases more of their personality disorder. So we really want to know what the frequency is, just as well as what the amount is, because frequency and amount are important concepts to understand, just as it is with alcohol. If a person is having a glass of wine with dinner on the weekend, or having a beer while they're watching a football game, we don't necessarily have red flags going up. But if we find that somebody is having a 6-pack of beer every single night, or a 5th of bourbon every night, we start understanding that there's a frequency and a quantity issue that is arising. What's already been said is that early use can increase the substance use disorder, because adolescent brains, as Dr. Collier was speaking about, and also Dr. Kasavajek also was talking about. And then we see that with increased use, we do see increased mental health problems. So there are challenges and there are benefits. Some of the challenges is one of the impacts could be what we end up seeing in emergency rooms and emergency clinics. We sometimes see patients who now are presenting with cyclic vomiting syndromes. That could be from the consumption of edibles. We also see unintended intoxication, and that is happening at a higher rate with pediatrics, because they may find cookies, brownies, or gummies that look just delicious, and they start eating them, or geriatric, where they may take a gummy for a medicinal reason, and after 15 minutes, not sensing any alteration or change, they might eat 2 more, not understanding that the gummies do take longer in the system to be activated. The other thing that's quite interesting is that there's a displacement of local homeless population by indigent cannabis tourists. And what do we mean by that? That means that if a neighboring state is not legalized, then we have a migration of younger folks who may be indigent, who want to come in and be able to use legally. But there also are benefits. And I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing with this presentation today. We would have standardized formulas, so we wouldn't have to worry about all of the other medications and drugs that are sometimes laced with marijuana that's illegal. We also would have dosing and labeling, as we do now with medical marijuana. There would be increased scrutiny as to how it was put together, and so the cleanliness of the marijuana, so that there wouldn't be fungi and other things that may be growing in it. There would be an increased room. We could take some of the money that Dr. Wilson was talking about and Dr. Shalom was talking about, and we could move that money into educational initiatives, because being well taught and well understood, it's the same as cigarette smoking, vaping, and alcohol use. People have to be taught what the benefits and what the negative aspects are. Also, and this is one of the biggest benefits I see, because I have patients who, due to chronic illnesses, are on medical marijuana. And it was a terrible cost for them. They had to go and get a marijuana card, which is a couple of $100s. They have to find a physician who has been able to write this prescription for marijuana. And they have to pay cash for it. These are all really big barriers, really big hurdles that my patients have had to go over in order to come off of opioids that they were previously using, and to be able to get the relief that they have been able to get through the use of medical marijuana. Were it to become legalized, many of these patients would be able to find safe marijuana that they would be able to use. So I'm just putting this up so that we have an understanding that right now the qualifying conditions for medical marijuana are multiple. And so for all of the people that are using medical marijuana and having relief from it and being able to come off of opioids because of it, it's really important for us to understand that there is a real benefit side to it as well. But there is that other side, and that is the side that we see in emergency departments, where we might have people coming in with acute psychiatric symptoms, people who never had any problems before, suddenly coming in with hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety, suicidal ideation, extreme fatigue, or it also can affect the cardiovascular system. So you have people with increased heart rates, you have chest pain, you can have cardiac arrest. You also have respiratory symptoms where the person is having difficulty breathing, especially those people who have any previous conditions like asthma or any other reasons why they wouldn't be smoking, that they might though think it would be okay to vape. There are neurological conditions, and unfortunately, seizures are not uncommon, because at least at this point, there are other things that are laced in it. But people who already have an underlying condition have to be educated as to the impact of using cannabis without understanding the possibilities. And then, of course, you have the ENT, the GI, and the GU symptoms that may come. So I consider these some of the unintended consequences. And I think that as we look at legalization, it's always the unintended consequences that make us have remorse, buyer's remorse. So we have to think about these behaviorally risky experiences that might happen with unintentional as well as intentional intoxication, because we don't want to pretend that everyone's not going to want to get as high as they can. There will be people who are going to use it so they can get as high as they can, just as people do with alcohol. We also, as Dr. Collier had gone over, for pregnant women, it has to be an education so that people understand, just like with alcohol, smoking or using cannabis during pregnancy can be really dangerous for the fetus. That we also see developmental delays, we can see brain damage, and that it crosses the breast milk. So when you're breastfeeding your child, you think you're doing something really positive, and in fact, you are having cannabis in your breast milk. There are other, here it is, the fact that there is an increased risk for stillborn. I don't think that's a widely understood piece because most people think of cannabis as being so safe. The mother is twice as likely to have problems during delivery and maybe having early delivery. So we see medical withdrawal symptoms and we have treatment modes for cannabis use disorder. And this is really important for parents and people who love another person who may have cannabis use disorder, just as we see with partners of people with alcoholism or any other dependence on any other drug. And you are going to see these kinds of symptoms. And unlike alcohol, because the half-life of cannabis is so long, you may not see any withdrawal symptoms for 24 to 48 hours after the person has had their last cannabis. When you see the worst is usually 4 days afterwards, and it is acute, and it can last for up to 2 weeks. So in the hospitals, oftentimes, if it is very acute, low doses of oral THC are used in order to bring them off of that withdrawal. Everything that we do in the hospital, we do based on the symptoms that are presented by the patient who comes in. And the very first thing we have to do is stabilize that intoxication and make sure that person is hydrated. We might have to give them anti-anxiety drugs as well as sedatives. We have to follow their vital signs very closely. And these are the people that are very high risk for falls. And that goes without saying whether they have cannabis use disorder or they are just using cannabis. We are not monitoring right now in these legalized states the number of people who have a fall incident and maybe have a TBI secondary to a fall incident, because we're not carefully looking at, well, were you eating, smoking, taking cannabis prior to your fall? So that's going to be something else that we have to look at. Also, this idea of doing a complete psychological evaluation, making sure that that person, before they are discharged from the hospital, actually has some follow-up so they have some support. Because if they have cannabis use disorder, if they have a dependence upon cannabis, it has to be treated just as any other substance where the person has a dependence that has developed. And that is all that I have to share. I do believe that Dr. Dean is going to be taking this idea of cannabis use disorder and mental health to the next level. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm just gonna elaborate just a little bit on some of the points that have been made. Let me just share my screen really quickly. All right, so I'm Dr. LaShawna Dean. I'm in the Department of Special Education, Professional Counseling, and Disability Studies. I'm a licensed therapist here in New Jersey, as well as a master addictions counselor. So really, Brenda, had covered so much, so I don't really need to beat a dead horse, but I just want to just point out a couple of things. A lot of studies are starting to come out, and when I say starting to come out, I mean in 2020, about the link between marijuana use and increased symptoms of psychiatric disorders, right? The problem is that they're starting to connect specific genes with us having a higher risk of developing psychosis from the use of marijuana. If you haven't done a thorough gene study, if you haven't been a participant in gene mapping, then you probably have no idea if you have the genes that could actually activate psychosis in you when you smoke marijuana. So what does that mean? You're out with your friends at a bonfire down in Jersey Shore and you start smoking weed and all of a sudden you're acting differently than your other friends, right? So this is something new and emergent that I think we really need to pay a lot of attention to because again, certain psychiatric disorders get exacerbated and some even activated after smoking marijuana. Here's the second thing I just want to pay really a close attention to. and that's that high potency marijuana is on the rise. So the marijuana that our parent generation was smoking wasn't that strong, right? Gave them a little buzz, a little high, and then it wore off quickly. However, the types of marijuana that people are using now are extremely potent. People are using resin versions. They're using the oils to make it even stronger, and that's something that we need to pay attention to. I'm not really sure when New Jersey is going to get to addressing that. And someone mentioned something about edibles. I'm not sure how they're going to address that just yet, but that is something that we have to be on the outlook for, because there's hybrid strands of sativa and indica that are even stronger, right? And so the high potency marijuana, if you smoke that every single day, it increases your chances of developing psychosis by nearly 5 times compared to people who never use marijuana at all. So now you have a 5 times more likely chance of having psychosis if you use those stronger versions. The other problem with marijuana research, which people really kind of don't understand, is doing advanced clinical gold standard trials at the federal level is really hard, because marijuana is still illegal at the federal level. So you can't just get 150,000 people in a trial and say, hey, let's test everybody and see what happens, because it's illegal, right? So you can't do that. Just now we're starting to get research in, but that's based on people who are already using. Not necessarily we're going to put them through different levels of potency and see how it affects the body. So it will be a very long time before we can have those cause and effect studies that we know, oh, this caused this, right? Marijuana use at this level caused this, because we can't test it federally. Just a little anecdotal story that happened with spice, right? Spice is a synthetic type of marijuana. It was created by a scientist so he could test out the effects of THC, or the psychoactive property in marijuana. He wanted to test it out on people with advanced problems in their brain and then pain problems. But unfortunately, someone found the formula, and then spice came to life, and now that's another thing that we're battling. Anyway, just Google spice if you want to know more about that. So Brenda Marshall talked a lot about all of these effects, so I really won't go into them too much more. I just want to make sure that you know that marijuana smoke is carcinogenic. The smoke that happens from marijuana can cause cancer. It has very similar effects to what tobacco does to the lung. So people who smoke marijuana regularly are at just as high of a risk of developing COPD and lung cancer as if they were smoking cigarettes. There's over 500 chemicals in marijuana, and all of those chemicals have different effects on our brain, our cognitive abilities, our mental health, and our physical body. And vaping, there was a recent study that came out about how vaping is really the most dangerous way to take in marijuana. So we have to get more studies on this, but this one, there was a huge issue not too long ago about how vitamin E vapor gets trapped in your lung, and that causes lung damage. And so just to wrap up my section, because I don't want to take away from our chair, Dr. Rahi Abu, who has a lot of information on the economic impact. Just know that a recent study, it just came out in 2020 by Serta and colleagues, found that cannabis use disorder in 12 to 17-year-olds is on the rise. So it went up 25% in those states that have legalized marijuana use. And it also went up in people over the age of 26. So it went up to 26% in those populations. So it's just something that we need to really, really pay attention to. No one mentioned it thus far, but the Cannabis Research Institute does not take a stance on whether marijuana should be legalized or not. We just want to provide you with every piece of information that we can. So don't think that, oh, we think yes or we think no, it shouldn't be legalized. We're just giving you all the information. It's up to you all to vote on November the 3rd about what you think should happen. So I'm going to end because I want to make sure Rahi has enough time.
Thank you, Lashana. Thanks very much. So I'm going to be talking about the economic implication of the cannabis legalization. So before I start, I have to talk about some caveats. First, policy research on cannabis legalization is still very young. So we don't have several studies that basically finding similar and in line results. So most of these studies are based on experiences in 1 or 2 or maybe 4 states that adopt the policy at earlier stages, so it may not be necessarily applicable to New Jersey. And another issue is the idea of association versus causation. So what we present here is basically some suggestive evidence about showing association, but causation might not be basically achieved here because there might be some third factor that could be related to both legalization of cannabis and the outcome that we are studying here. So I'm going to be talking about the labor market effects of cannabis legalization. I'm going to be talking about cannabis taxation, and hopefully if we have some time, I'll be talking about the models for recreational cannabis legalization for the state of New Jersey. So in terms of labor market outcomes, I specifically looked at 2 particular outcomes, unemployment rate and workers' compensation claiming. So consumption of cannabis and legalization of cannabis could affect labor markets in 2 dimensions, on the supply side and the demand side. What is the supply side? Basically on the labor force, those who supply labor force. How? By basically, cannabis has some therapeutic properties for pain medication, and people use cannabis and they can treat their pain. So it's a good substitute for opioids, probably based on the existing evidence. So it doesn't have the side effects of opioids, such as addiction, and therefore there might be some basically improved labor force outcomes there. On the other hand, on the demand side of the labor force, meaning that job creation, basically, legalization of cannabis and specifically legalization of sales of cannabis could create some jobs because we have some new industries in the business of growing, processing, distributing, and retailing of legalized cannabis. So to look at some empirical evidence about these questions, I specifically focus on a recent study, which is still a working paper. This is not a published paper, working paper, basically available in 2020 by Chakraborty and others. So based on this evidence, authors found that cannabis sales, so opening a dispensary in a given county in the state of Colorado, would reduce the unemployment rate by about 6.6%, meaning that the study is just limited to Colorado from 2011 to 2018 at a county level. So in counties that there were operational dispensaries, recreational dispensaries, we experienced a 6.6% decline in unemployment rate. There was no effect on wages or labor force participation, suggesting that probably that therapeutic feature of cannabis does not play a role, at least in Colorado. So what is the implication of this study for the state of New Jersey? The projected unemployed people in New Jersey in August 2020 was about 500,000 population. If all the counties in the state of New Jersey open up dispensaries, after 1 year, we might be able to observe some decline, 6.6% decline in unemployment rate, which was going to be about 30,000 people, new people at work. So that's a basically interesting feature of the policy. As I said, remember the caveats that I mentioned at the beginning. So there might be some different estimated effect due to some pre-existing conditions or some pre-existing situation in the state of New Jersey compared to Colorado. So the second labor market outcome that I investigate, and this is a working paper that my colleagues and I are working on. It would be out pretty soon. We looked at the cannabis legalization, recreational cannabis legalization, the effect of recreational cannabis legalization on workers' compensation claiming. Compensations are being paid to workers or their families due to injury at work. So this compensations cost the US about $62 billion in 2017. So again, due to therapeutic features of cannabis for pain medication. People might use cannabis, they might feel less pain, and that might increase their productivity and working capacity. And that might lead to fewer injury rates, fewer injuries at work, and lower prevalence of filing for workers' compensation claiming. So based on the research that we have done from 2011 to 2018 among the adults ages 40 to 62, we found that cannabis-related admission to treatment facilities rose by about 25%. This is significant and very alarming. First, we show that after legalization, adults do consume more cannabis. So this is under basically a very serious outcome, which is the admission to treatment facilities due to cannabis. But we anticipate that, and there are other studies suggesting similar size of the effect after legalization. We also find that worker compensation claiming reduces by about 20% due to an increased consumption of cannabis, and non-fatal injury rate goes down by about 4.2%. So if these estimates are valid for the state of New Jersey, we will see that after legalization, between 2,500 to 5,000 additional new patients would be basically would go to the treatment facilities to get care. On the other hand, there would be about 840 fewer work-related non-fatal injuries after legalization due to the legalization and due to using cannabis as pain medication. So again, be careful about interpreting these results. It's just a projection of our existing result based on 10 states that have legalized cannabis for recreational purposes between 2011 and 2018. So the other question is, okay, we want to legalize cannabis, what should we do? So the question is more complicated than just saying that we should legalize and we shouldn't legalize. It's not a 0-1 outcome. It's a spectrum. So there are lots of conditions, there are lots of situations, there are lots of factors that we should consider here. So first of all, for example, how should we tax cannabis in our state? So there are three major tax regimes. Tax per unit, for example, tax per ounce of cannabis. So this is what Alaska has done. And in this regime, the tax revenue does not depend on the price of cannabis. It doesn't matter the price is $1 or $100. You tax based on per unit of that product. Tobacco tax is another example per pack. So we pay taxes per pack. So we don't tax per the price of pack of cigarettes, basically. Another version of the tax is ad valorem, or a percentage of the total amount purchased. This is a mechanism that Colorado, Washington, and Oregon have been using. So 20% of the price would be taxed as cannabis tax. So you'll see the rates, actual rates in the next slides. And a more progressive taxation policy is tax on potency. We know that the potency of cannabis have been going up significantly during the past 30 years. In 1980s, the potency, the concentration of THC was very low. Now it's much higher due to some research and some work have been done on this area. So the products are more potent these days. So tax on potency would be dollar tax per percentage of THC, not the amount of cannabis, or not the price of price per ounce of cannabis. So it's just tax per percentage of THC that you buy. So if you want to buy a product which is high THC, you have to pay more taxes. This is very progressive of taxing. So if this method of taxation is being implemented in the state of New Jersey, we expect to see that the potency declines, tax revenue also declines, but we can guarantee some improvement, or we can guarantee that the public health wouldn't really exacerbate that bad compared to other states that use other types of taxation. So this is a more kind of conservative way of taxing cannabis, but it has never been implemented in any state yet. So to talk about the tax revenue, we see that the takeaway from this slide is that although taxation is a big issue and one of the major reasons why state governments want to legalize cannabis is to basically get the tax revenue. This tax revenue is only about 1% of the total tax revenue of the whole state. Comparing the 2017 data from 4 states that adopted the cannabis legalization policy, we see that, for example, Colorado earned about $250 million in tax. The total tax revenue in Colorado in 2017 was about 28 billion, so it's less than 1% of the total tax from cannabis legalization. They also use it for public school, which is a nice, basically, kind of policy. Some states basically specified the source where these tax revenues should be spent on. And you see that the highest tax rate is for the state of Washington, then Colorado and Oregon, and Alaska has a different tax basically mechanism. And another issue to consider about legalization is that if you want to legalize, it's better to be the first among the neighbors, because that would basically generate more revenues. Based on a study by Hansen and others 2020, they find that after Oregon adopted the cannabis legalization in 2015, there was about 40% decline in tax revenues in the state of Washington that adopted the policy in 2014, suggesting that probably about $44 to $75 million of tax was basically the revenue was from the cross-border shoppers coming from the state of Oregon. So that would be in the case of New Jersey, we will see that probably shoppers from the state of New York or Connecticut or Pennsylvania would be traveling to, although this is illegal, but that's what's happening in practice. So the legality of the issue is another topic that we don't have probably time to talk about it today. So another issue, I was excited about this graph and I wanted to show that here. This is a graph that digitized by my team based on data from cannabis prices from 2010 to 2018 from the state of New Jersey. This is illicit market cannabis price obtained from High Times magazine. You see that between the 2010 and 2018 period, the cannabis price, illicit cannabis, basically declined by about 30%. So this is suggestive that overall trend in the price of cannabis is declining. So what does it mean? So basically this gets us to a question that what kind of model should we have for the state of New Jersey? As Steve mentioned, the state of New Jersey has not yet have any clear-cut plan for regulation. So this could be a good thing or could be a bad thing. It could be a good thing if we can develop new and sound policies, very sound policies with less unintended consequences and more benefit to the population. So there are some questions that we should be able to address to basically design our policy in the state of New Jersey. First, should the government process, distribute, and sell the products, or the government should basically ask the private sector to do that? If the government does that, the price of cannabis would be higher than the competitive market price. So the tax revenue might be higher, but there's always a problem with the illicit market and cartels and drug cartels. So that's one thing that we should consider. How should we tax cannabis? So which model of taxation are we going to use? So that's another question that is very important and we should be careful about. How should we regulate cannabis advertising? So there has been some evidence from the state of California that advertising is illegal, but there are some billboard advertising, especially in San Diego, and some cities across the United States are banning any type of advertising, including billboard advertising. So this is something that we should address in New Jersey's law, that how we're going to deal with the cannabis advertising, because it might target the underage population. And related to the underage population, we should be able to consider the cannabis retailers compliance inspections. There are some positive experience with the state of Washington that they have regular inspections done, especially inspections targeting the sales to minors, making sure that retailers do not sell products to the underage population, because that's a really very important group of population. And finally, another important group of population is the elderly population, So that's a very important group of population. And I have done a research published in International Journal of Drug Policy studying the effect of medical cannabis laws and cardiac death. And I've shown that after legalization, there has been about 3% increase in cardiac death, which suggests that probably we should be very careful in prescribing or getting cannabis when it comes to the older adults. So that's something that we should be very careful. So there are a lot of research going on, and we should take all of them into account and see what kind of policy would help the state of New Jersey to go forward with this attempt and legalization of cannabis. So I think I'm done. So just a brief, just to wrap up the session, I would like to talk about the way that Cannabis Research Institute can basically collaborate, can basically work with state, local, and municipal agencies to basically help them to design a sound policy in different aspects. We have enough, more than enough actually, basically facilities and also expertise in our university to provide these services, and we'll be glad to hear from all who are interested. You can reach out to us at cri@wpunj.edu, and I hope you have a productive time basically with our presentation and webinar today. And if there's anything to add, you guys can add. Otherwise, I have nothing else to basically talk about.
Just want to point out that there's just a few lingering questions in the Q&A. We've answered 27, it looks like, but there's 4 that are open. So if any of the panelists want to quickly respond to, I think the anonymous attendee has asked about the tax rate, just wanted to specify the tax rate. I think that's really the only open one that's left, actually. So that's all I was going to say. But thank you for everyone who's attended tonight. And again, if you want to contact us in any way, you can contact us at cri@wpunj.edu. Right, Rahi?
Exactly, yes. Anything, anybody wants to add anything?
I just want to thank everybody for coming and spending the evening with us. And I hope that this was informative and provided both sides of the question. Every question has 2 sides, every issue has 2 sides, and it's for us to weigh both sides and come up with our own decisions and to vote.
Thanks, Brenda. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here today. So have a good evening and bye.